Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be providing some knowledge that I've been acquiring through the years on the modeling of ecological data that have some spatial structure. And of course, there's a lot of methods, and I won't be able to go in detail in all of them, but I think we need to start with some kind of general notion before we jump on the statistical part. So data are having some dependency due to space, and this is Tobler's first law of geography, where everything is related to everything else, but nearby observation are more related than distance one. So this is the principle that make it important to have spatial regression, spatial model to account for this dependency. Then to measure the degree of dependency, maybe the dependency is very weak, or it could be positive or negative. So we measure it using an index of spatial autocorrelation, and I put colors so that people understand what I mean by autocorrelation and spatial autocorrelation. So autocorrelation is the relationship between the quantitative value of a variable with itself according to distance. And we have this kind of possibility of having positive autocorrelation, where the dark values are more near to one another and light value close to one another. Let me do this. Where is this? Of course, I don't see it. Sorry about that. So here you see my cursor now, yes? Okay, so those are positive autocorrelation. Then they could be random values throughout the region. The high values and the low values are all having no pattern. And then it could be a checkboard, a negative autocorrelation. So this is why we need to have models that will accommodate for that. But depending of the source of structure, it's important to differentiate the fact that there could be some spatial dependency due to the environmental conditions. So here in this cartoon here on the below, I have two patches of dark gray and light gray. So they have some kind of structure in space, and maybe there's specific seed that grow on those patches. So the black seed are only in that patch, and the white seed on the other patch. So now what we're going to say is the seed have some kind of spatial dependency on the structure of the soil properties. Yet the seeds are coming from trees, so there's kind of seed dispersal. So now what we see is that the seed from the black trees are maybe more close to the trees, if we know where the trees were in the black condition, the trees and the white one, the coniferous one. So then this is a process of dispersal. So then that's usually what people think of autocorrelation. So it's this kind of property of the system under study. So here what I want to stress, so that often we have both spatial dependency and spatial autocorrelation, but the packages that we're using, the R packages, will not differentiate the origin of the spatial pattern. It will just tell you there is some spatial pattern, and it's you as a researcher to be able to design your study so that you can discriminate the source of the biotic interaction versus abiotic relationship. So that's important to realize that. Then there's other source of spatial dependency due to the size of the processes, but the way that we sample it and the way that we analyze it. So that's important to realize that. Is there a way to hide this thing so that I know it? Excellent. So there's several aspects that could be important to consider when we talk about spatial dependency. In fact, there's several ways in which that could occur. So the first of all is we sample things at exactly some specific location that have XY coordinates. And then we maybe measure the Euclidean distance between them or the least cost path, depending if you're looking at animal movement in a fragmented landscape. Then you can assess the degree of spatial autocorrelation, like I said, and spatial dependency. There could be the fact that you want to use covariate to explain the spatial pattern. So it's kind of the spatial dependency or other factors of movement between regions. Then there could be spatial legacy. So the configuration and composition of the landscape will influence what is potentially occurring as processes. And then there's contingency, which is the surrounding of each location could be important. This is related to also maybe if you're studying animal, the perception, how far the animal is finding the resources needed. So contingency and perception could be the same in some cases and some not. Maybe the contingency is really the environment, the spatial dependency of local condition versus how the animal perceive it. Then it could be that you have more than one processes, there's multiple scale. So you need to decompose the process in several spatial dimension. And then there's all this kind of movement between patches, meta-population, meta-community, meta-ecosystem, or meta-network. So when we talk about spatial regression, maybe we are not considering all those aspects, or maybe they're all there and we need to be aware of that. So one way to represent what we want to do is we have this response variable y, and this is the space of the environmental condition that we are going to study. So there could be some error, and we hope that we can explain this response variable with some environmental variable of interest. And then there could be some space that is important, all those spatial aspects that I presented to you. So if there is no relationship between space and the environment, we call that this legacy or this kind of multiple scale, and that could be of interest versus the covariability between space and the environment, so the dependency that I was talking about. So we may want to filter that out. So you need to understand where is the influence of space in your covariables. So then people will talk about that the overlap is a statistical nuisance for regressions, and that's your enemy. So you would like to get rid of it, and you would like to account for spatial autocorrelation in the residual of your regression. Then other people say, no, space is your friend, so you want to include it in your regression as a parameter. So there's different ways to include space. You could just put XY coordinate, you could put the Euclidean distance or the viscous path or the connectivity matrix or the weight between adjacent location. So those are all different ways to analyze the data. But let's start with what is a linear regression. So the linear regression here is really a case where you have the error are independent. There's no spatial dependency. So you have your environmental variable covariate. You have this correlation, a linear correlation in this case, and some error that are independent. If we visualize it, this is the perfect case where we just have environmental variable that affect our response variable and of course some errors. In the spatial context, that means that here we don't have any autocorrelation in the predictors and no autocorrelation in the response. So there is really no dependency and no autocorrelation. So that's the perfect case. So in this book chapter with Hélène Wagner, we simulate some data to see when is it important, because maybe very weak autocorrelation is not important, and in which context this present autocorrelation is important. So here we have the response variable, predictor is some errors. Here everything is random. We know the real simulated data, and we estimate are true, and the correlation, the regression is valid. There's no autocorrelated residual in this case. Then there could be other possibilities. So what I just presented to you was the upper panel. And here in the second one, what we are seeing is that the predictor has some spatial structure, and then not the response or the error. So in this case, the regression is also correct. The residual are not significant, so very weak spatial autocorrelation in the residual, and our type 1 error is almost still okay. Then there could be the case where you have in your residual some spatial autocorrelation, which imply that your response variable maybe has some autocorrelation, but not your predictors. So here the correlation, the regression is maybe still valid, but you have in your residuals the presence of autocorrelation, like we can see a little bit the pattern here in the U matrix. And of course, both could be having some autocorrelation. So you could have your predictor and the errors that have spatial autocorrelation. So now your regression is not correct. Your residual have very strong. This is very, I will present that a little bit later, but the autocorrelation usually is when we use MNI will vary between -1 to +1. So +1 would be a perfect match of pattern. So 0.6 is very strong autocorrelation. And then the type 1 error is to the roof. So this is a case where the regression would not be valid. So this is why we need to have other methods to analyze such a data set. So just here, again, what are the implications of spatial autocorrelation? So it depends again of the intensity of autocorrelation. It will inflate the type 1 error, as we saw in the previous slide. So it's a risk of false positive. It could bias the parameter estimation. So it could be that the effective size would be overestimated. And then the one that I think is visualized underneath is to show that here in the presence of autocorrelation, your variance is going to be narrower. So you will have maybe confidence interval that are going to be too small. So all those things will affect your regression. So again, the ideal situation will be here in the linear model where there's no impact of space versus this other cases where we see there's overlap, so some kind of dependency and autocorrelation in the data that we're analyzing. But of course, there's millions of other possibilities, and it will depend on how much the space is all included in the environmental variable, and there's no legacy. There's legacy and nothing in the environmental condition. They completely overlap or different possibility. So you need to have a little bit more understanding of what you're doing when you are doing a regression, because there could be all those possibilities. So we can classify spatial regression in two big family of methods. So the first one is the case where the spatial process are created by spatial autocorrelation, SWOT dependency or autocorrelation. So we need to account for it. And one way to do so is using a generalized linear mixed model, a spatial error model, spatial autoregressive model. Another series of methods that are also called spatial regression is to do some kind of spatial filtering. This is a case where we have maybe multiple processes or factors that are affecting the data at multiple spatial scale. So what we need to do now is to detect what are those key scales and to remove or partial out the effect of those scales. So this is spatial filtering. So here, this is not new that people have been facing those situations. So the simple way was to do what we call transsurface analysis, is to add to your regression the XY coordinate, as simple as that, lat long of your data. So that's maybe you think that there's spatial dependency in your data, maybe not any spatial autocorrelation. So this is known as the polynomial regression, where you add different exponent power to the coordinates, and then you could have a quadratic, cubic, and different shape. This is good if the pattern that you're studying is over the entire study area, but if there's different type of spatial structure, this is not going to be as useful as a method. That's why several other methods have been developed. And for you who were at the presentation last month of Zur and Inyo, they presented different method of generalized mixed model. So here, in the case of spatial autocorrelation or any kind of dependency temporal analysis, you can use the random effect to control for spatial structures. So we can do this using the location. So add a subscript in our regression. So now each observation has a subscript, and we can do some blocking of zoning to account for the spatial structure in the data. Then there's what people often in geography were doing 50 years or more ago is autoregressive analysis. So this is to say that the location, this kind of dependency or contingency is important. So nearby observation are affecting the value at a given location. So this is a series of different methods. And here what we are saying in the relationship that I'm showing here is that the response variable is influencing its own pattern. So I'm interested now in the spatial autocorrelation of the response variable. So those methods are known as the simultaneous and autoregressive model. And then this is a case where the error is accounting by the neighborhood structure versus the conditional autoregressive model, where is the response variable that has some kind of effect. So this response variable would be here, and the error could be also autocorrelated. So they are quite similar. Their algorithm is very close to one another. The way you are assessing neighboring value could be a little bit different here as presented by a C or a W matrix. So here is just to show that you are looking at this neighborhood and there's only the distance is the only thing important. You don't look at anisotropy with such models. In a recent paper with Geographical and other very bright mathematicians, statisticians, this paper presents different common objectives that people can find with spatial autoregressive model, the CAR and the SAR. So this paper just stressed back to ecologists that those methods are available to us and not just to mathematicians, statisticians, or geographers that have been using them more than us. So the first goal of such CAR and SAR is to do this kind of model comparison or model selection. So which model is the best? Is to include the spatial structure in the residual or in the response variable? Is of course doing a regression to estimate the coefficient of the explanatory variable explaining the response, maybe to estimate the degree of spatial autocorrelation, because those autoregressive models that were developed for time series analysis that you look at the next time series, in space you look at the neighbors. So nearby observation are more similar to one another. So that's the degree of spatial autocorrelation or connectivity that could exist between your sites, your sampling location. You can definitely, the same way that you do this connectivity, you can know how much the neighborhood is the first neighbor, second neighbor, that is important. Then you can have this prediction. So that's not something that usually people use CAR and SAR. They will use geostatistic, but you can do exactly the same thing. You could predict the value at on-sample location with those methods. And then you can smooth the information to know the importance of nearby observation. So this is just to stress that this is something you can use. And maybe why people were not using them is because they thought that the CAR and SAR could be only used with a regular lattice. And this in this paper with J. Verhaas, it's very clear that you can use polygons. So here is information about harbor seal abundance in Alaska. So there's 463 polygons. And then you can just do your neighborhood by using the first neighbor, the second neighbor. So you can just do a network of connectivity, and those methods can be used as well. Then, of course, spatial autocorrelation dependency can be both occurring at the same time. As I mentioned, the current packages that we use, MRNI, Gary C, or Verogram, would not differentiate the origin of those spatial patterns. So what can we do in a regression is to put all this structure in the residual. So this is the spatial error model, or the generalized least square algorithm allow us to do that. So here what we see is that in our linear regression, we will have those components that I showed you previously, the intercept, the beta regression coefficients, and some errors. And now all the spatial structure is pushed into a new error matrix that is this kind of covariance matrix that is fitting the structure of the data. So a little bit when I was showing you the U matrix previously. So here we can have this kind of Verogram model in the error. And this kind of method is possible only because we have now computer power. So what you need to do first is you need to compute a least square regression, and then look at your residual, fit the best error model, and then reassess the overall analysis. So this is something that was impossible in the past, but with the computer power now it's feasible. Then life, it could be that there's more than one processes, like Jody was presenting at the beginning. Now we have access to much larger data set over a larger region. So what is going to happen is that maybe you have this kind of, with the gray now you cannot see, but there could be a large scale, but it could be some kind of patchiness as well. So you may have several processes and several scale at which the variables of interest are varying. So this is a case where you need to filter out and identify the appropriate scale of those processes. So this is a case where, again, space and environments are related to one another. So this is where you will use now a spatial filtering regression. So this is now known as a family of method, the Moran-Eigenvector map. And what is happening, so let's say again, you have our regression, we have our environmental variables that are not influenced by space, that's what we would like to have, and our errors. But if of course, there could be some environmental variables that have some spatial pattern, this kind of dependency, and some kind of legacy of space. So there could be a large scale, a mesoscale, or a small scale, as I showed you here. There could be more than one scale, and you need to decompose the signal. So when I was showing you the trans-surface analysis previously, it was good for the large scale, but it would not account for those other scale of the processes. So a trans-surface analysis would be good for one scale, but would not be able to sum all those other processes. So this is a method that allow us to decompose the space in different scales. So this is a method not proposed, but presented by Borka and al. In 2002. And if you're very interested, I think Stefan Dreh paper in 2011 is very well presenting this information. So how does it work? So I need to spend a little bit of time here because it's important to realize what we want to do. We want to find those large scale and those intermediate scale in the data. And to do so, we're going to use what Borka and Legendre proposed back then in 2002, this principal coordinate neighborhood matrix, PCNN. that is now being discovered as part of this broader family of Morgan eigenvector map that is called the distance-based Morgan eigenvector map. So let's take a simple case as presented by Burkhardt and Lejeune in 2002, where you have the XY coordinate of a transect to make our life easy and the variable of interest. So the same way that we use XY coordinate with transsurface analysis, in some case, like I mentioned the slide before, you cannot maybe capture the patchiness and the fact that there's multiple scale. So the first step is to compute an Euclidean distance between each of observations. So you have 11 sites, so you will have an 11 by 11. And then nearby observation are more important than further away observation. So then there's some voodoo, and the voodoo is that you are kind of looking at the Euclidean distance, and everything that is kind of more than the maximum distance, you kind of truncate it. So this is voodoo. I'm still not sure mathematically what it is, but it works. So you do this truncated Euclidean distance of neighboring value, and you use a principal coordinate analysis to have the eigenvector of each sampling location based on the Euclidean distance between them. So then with principal components analysis, you have negative values usually, you have a 0 definitely, and positive value. So in this analysis, you keep only the positive eigenvectors, and you do a regression with your response variable. So you can do a multiple regression, or you could do a redundancy analysis or some other methods if you have more than one response variable. So this is a complex way to obtain, if I can go back, those different scales. So this principal component analysis is going to give you those sine, cosine for each kind of vector. You will have a appropriate scale corresponding to it, and which is important to realize is that as many sampling location you have, there's a potential of the same number of eigenvectors. Not all of them will be positive or negative. And it could be that you came up with a lot of them. So as I would illustrate a little bit further down. So this is filtering and decomposing the spatial pattern in those multiple scale is not a source of knowledge. It's just trying to fit the data the best to those different scales. So that's important. And again, I will come back to that later on. Then, of course, you could have not only a large scale, smaller scale, but you could have some regions, so administrative regions. So this is administrated by someone that has different goals, and this other one is maybe different soil type. So you can have not only several processes, but you can have several regions. So this is a case where the eigenvector maps will not be able to capture those several regions. So one solution is to do a regression for each sampling location. So this is known as the geographically weighted regression, GWR. And this is a case where you look at neighborhood. So again, you are looking for each observation and you are computing a regression for each sampling location. And the neighborhood is given by some kind of rules. So you can decide, I want as many neighbors to have a regression that isn't enough strong, or I want to include some kind of distance. So there's different ways of assessing your neighborhood to compute the spatial autocorrelation. And because you are doing a regression for each location, you have the best possibility for this regional context. So the residual of such a weighted regression is also going to be lower because you have always the best fit regardless where you are. even though you need to account for the number of parameters and so on and so forth. But a lot of people don't like this method because you're overfitting. You have the same observation that are used to analyze, and you have if you have 100 points, you will have 100 regressions. And so Daniel Griffith really disliked this method, and I can see why. And why I'm presenting it, because you can use it to decide where are your regions. So if you have some kind of region that has the same kind of parameters and same regression, you say maybe I can find my regions in this region of study. So here I want to use an example that's been published in a book chapter with Stephanie Meles. And the data that I provide to you are almost this data, but not exactly. There's a slight differences, so don't expect to have exactly the same number that I will present here. So these are information of bird sighting based on the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas from 2001 to 2005 using 10 by 10 kilometers. So each square is a 10 by 10 kilometers. So the different color of gray is different intensity of forest cover, and the size of the dot is the number of sighting of ovenbird through the sampling procedure. So this information was used with Stephanie Meles. We first measured the degree of spatial autocorrelation in the raw data. So this is a case where we have a correlogram, and here the square is for the forest, the circle is for the hovenberg, and you can see the relationship is very strong, as here we can see there's a south-north gradient of forest, and the birds are matching the amount of forest in their number of sighting. So the strong spatial autocorrelation, and definitely significant. And here the number of cells, we have 1,359 of them. So there's a lot of information in that analysis. So then the first step is to do a linear regression. So when we do that, the R square is 0.43. And the map here is the residuals. And the now correlogram is a correlogram based on the residual from such analysis, linear regression. So we can see we have some kind of pocket of very negative residual, some positive residual, negative here and there. But the value of spatial autocorrelation that was very high to start with now is in the residual decreased to 0.35 in the first distance class, and so on and so forth. So there is still some pattern in the data that the ordinary least square regression could not fit. So we need to use those other spatial regression models. So let's look at our friend that is not like the geographically weighted regression. So here on the left panel, those are the pseudo R squared and not exactly R squared, they kind of in the spirit of R squared, but a good indication. And because we have as many regression that we have sample points, the range of those values will be between, for this analysis, not in the one that you will use, 0.19 to 0.82. So I have very good fit in some region and very poor fits in others. So that's what I say. I like it to say, okay, maybe I need to stratify or to have sub-region and do the analysis only for those regions that have high value. Then on the right, we have now the map of the residual of the regression. And you can see that there is some kind of value that are high or low, but maybe a little bit more scattered than what we had. If I could go back here, we had pockets that created this spatial autocorrelation that we have seen in the residual. Then there's a method I have not presented per se, but is similar to the generalized least square method, is called the regression trigging. So the geostatistic group has a lot of methods, And they are some kind of similarity with what people are doing in statistics. So in geostatistics, their generalized least square method, they call it the regression trigging. So it's the same idea to fit a trend and look at the residual and put this a kind of variogram in the residual matrix. So when we do that, in this case, now with the regression trigging, the R square is 0.68, so better than the least square, and in the average of the geographical weighted regression. But unlike the geographical weighted regression, we have only one regression for the entire region versus 1,359 as we have number of sampling locations. So you need to know exactly what you want, and you want to decompose the scale. You want to have some kind of more filtering or putting the error in the residuals. So you need to be a little bit more knowledgeable of what you really want to do. So now, when I accepted to give this presentation, R was working like a breeze. So I say, no problem. But since, I don't know, RStudio and R, and I don't know, I've been fighting for 3 weeks, honestly. So I'm sorry about that. So if you're lucky, you will be able to do ggplot. I'm not able to do ggplot anymore. I have no clue why. But if you just do a plot, this is just to show you the same data set that you're going to have of the ovenbird and forest. And here, this is just a more intense location of sighting of the ovenbird in this area. The different packages that are available, well, of course, we have our generalized linear mixed model. We have this kind of R square, the amount of variance explained by the random factor and the fixed factor. We have the generalized, I'm dyslexic. I just realized I inversed the S and the L. Sorry about that. I will correct that. So it's generalized linear square analysis. Then there's the library SPDev that has those wonderful ways to do the generalized least square methods, that is for autoregressive error or autoregressive lag. Then you have this geographically weighted regression. There's vegan for the Moore eigenvector map. Then for CAR conditional autoregressive model, there's other packages. You can do this more spatial filtering with Moore eigenvector map with spatial regression. And there's maybe a lot of other ones, of course. So, because my R code is not working completely, I now will present the slide of the response of the R code, and then we will go to the R code after that. So here, just to show what would be the ordinary least square. That's amazing how dyslexic I am. Sorry about that. Definitely the forest influenced the sighting of the birds and is significant. And we explain, like I said, the data that I gave you are not exactly the same one from Stephanie Mellis and myself. So the adjusted R square is 49. Then if we just do trend surface analysis, so it's just using the UTM, the longitude and latitude. So now the R square is much better, is 0.6, 60%. Just adding XY coordinate. And in this case, it's maybe good because we have really this strong trend of south, and we are dealing with a quadrat of 10 by 10 kilometer. So all the kind of behavior within the quadrat, we have no information about it. So we have the large scale of the species distribution as a function of forest in that case. So here, if we do AIC, what we found is that definitely the linear model that was that just R square was 49. With transsurface analysis was 60. If we use the generalized linear mixed model without a fixed effect, just the random effect, or with fixed and random effects. So here the random effects that I provide to you in the data set is just a zoning 9 zone, where I just created arbitrary those 9 zones as a function of forest cover. So this is just for the example of the exercise here. Then now I spell it well, spatial regression using the generalized least square model. So now I decided to use 4 different ways. So I can maybe consider in an autoregressive model. So this is the way to say I'm interested in the bird, giving the forest, and the autoregressive of only the longitude, or only of the latitude, of both latitude and longitude, or to do some, erase. That's not true here, what I'm saying. So here is using in the spatial error a linear variogram. And the last one is using in the error a spherical variogram. So this is with a nugget effect and so on. So those are kind of this third one is in spirit the same kind of transsurface analysis that we have seen. And this one is plateauing when the spatial variance is not important anymore. So when we do this, what we see with the AIC, and of course the R package will complain a tiny bit that they are not on the same footing, but just for sake of comparison here. So basically with just a linear model, the AIC was minus 900, with the transsurface analysis was minus 12,000. Then the mixed model was not so good. When I include only the longitude, it was not so good. When I include the latitude, it was better. When I use both, so if you look carefully, those 2 AIC of transsurface analysis and this linear model, the variograms are quite comparable, because the data that I have is really having a strong linear surface response. And then when I do the spherical variogram, that's the best fit. And I just add this here to remind you that this is the reason of this best fit, which is a transsurface analysis, is that my variograms are very linear. So at that scale of 10 by 10 kilometer, I really just have this big surface trend from south to north and east to west. Okay, so now let's see how this decomposition of scale, maybe there's more than one scale in such a data set, right? So let's use this distance big base Moran eigenvector maps. And when I do this, so I had 1,359 observation, and those that were positive, there was only, well, still quite a lot, 711 of them. And the adjusted R square, when I do the multiple regression, is 71. So it's much better than the transsurface analysis or the linear model. But, and when I will go to the example in R, I will show you this. Out of those 711 eigenvector map that have different sign and cosine, they look alike at one point, you know, so you need to be selecting maybe a subset that are first, not all of them are significant, and you want to maybe keep some kind of large scale, mesoscale, and fine scale. So I did that. I select 10 of those Moran eigenvector maps that were significant and had different range of scale, and that's give me a value of 73%. So then with the several scale and several region, when we use the double GWR, you need to realize that you will have what they call the quasi-global R square. So that's the value for the entire region, but there's a range of value from this point A81 to a minus value, which is very discouraging. So there's as many regression points that there is in sampling locations. So there's 1,359 of them. And this is the box plot of those kind of pseudo R square here. So then if we look at all those AIC and those adjusted R square, well, the best one is, of course, when we use this geographical weighted regression, but this is an artifact of just a sub-region. The eigenvector maps is quite good. And then the spherical one with the residual is also not so bad. So what is happening here is important to, again, always be critical and say, what do I really want? Do I want to have a better R square? Or do I want to understand the processes, the factor? So in this case of having so many eigenvectors, just by adding a lot of predictor, my regression is going to be better. The R square will be better. But I'm not gaining more knowledge about the reason why I have the spatial pattern. So this is something to be critical. So all those factors are important, and that's what I was trying to convey to you, that space is maybe your last resort. And I'm teaching spatial statistics. I'm known for spatial autocorrelation and everything, but I say, don't use space if you have predictors. So basically, space is your last resort. You will have a better fit, as I should show you here, by adding all those different scale, you have better fit, but have you gained knowledge? So if you want to gain knowledge, you should focus on the processes and the factor. So this is what I wanted to convey to you. So if life is good, I will stop sharing. And I will go to our studio. Okay, can people see our studio? Yes, okay, great. Okay, so there's different libraries. And again, I don't know why ggplot is not working anymore for me. I don't know why I cannot use this mu min anymore. So I put them into a comment. Then there's the data that I'm giving you. And I just plot them. And if you're lucky, you can still do ggplot just to show that's what we are going to study. And then just the ordinary regression. And I scale them if you want. People prefer to scale your data, so you can scale them, but it's kind of comparable. And now this is just to show you the plot your data, rule number one. So the relationship between the forest and the birds. So there's a lot of zero sighting that's skewing the information. But then after there's a good match of relationship between the amount of forest and the birds, as we have seen. Then you could look at your residuals. Again, the same thing, the fit of your bird observation. It's kind of okay, but there's a lot of zeros, not perfect. Then there's a trend surface analysis. So here, this relationship is really simple, where I use lat long. It's very just no coefficient, just putting those two information of the location of the data. That's it, in UTM. So here, again, it's very significant. The R square adjusted is much better. Then you could do the generalized linear mixed model. And I'm just looking at the random factor versus the fixed factor and random factor. So I have 9 zones, like I was saying to you, and they are very arbitrary. I don't know why this not work anymore, but used to work at one point. So here again, have 9 zones and the values of the intercept and the fixed factors, as I showed you. Then here I spell it right. So here, this is the generalized least square model with the package NLME. So just to make sure I use that to make sure that we use the right one. Then, as I showed you in the PowerPoint, I'm just using the longitude, the latitude. Then I'm using a linear correlogram and a spherical correlogram. Just to let you know, those 2 ones, especially the spherical one, take quite a bit of time to compute. So don't disappear. It will work, but it takes quite a bit of time. So then you have those different models and values. Then there's the part where you need to compute the spatial lag. So you need to have this kind of who's my neighbors. In this case, it's a regular grid, but it's not a full grid. So we use this kind of tessellation. In my case, I use just Delaunay. You could use another one to compute neighbors. Then you use that in this other package that doesn't work for me anymore. I don't know why. That is computing the spatial lag with the SPDIF. Then you could do the spatial error again with the SPDIF, and it doesn't work. No clue. Then I compare the AIC like I showed you in the PowerPoint. So here are my AIC, and you will complain a tiny bit, but that's live. Then the multi-scale analysis is the PCNM. So this is with vegan. Then you need to compute an Euclidean distance. You use this Euclidean distance to compute the eigenvector maps. Then you will have, in this case, that are positive only, still a lot, 711 of them. You need to use this option to be able to see all of them, because RStudio will have a limit of outputs, and it's interesting to see throughout what are those values. Oh, this is wrong. I kept 10 now. So sorry, this was maybe a previous version. Sorry. So here, that's what I wanted to show you. Those are what I had previously, the intercept in the forest. And now those are all the PCNM eigenvector that are created. So the first one is a large scale. Sine, cosine, only a large scale one. And it's highly significant. And then the second one will be kind of similar. So basically the first ones are kind of all providing the same information. Then at 11, that scale is not significant. And then some are significant again, not significant. So you see that not all those eigenvectors are significant to explain the pattern of our hummingbird. And then more you go up, now I'm 100 some, less are significant and less and less. And basically not many of them are significant at larger value of principal component analysis. But what is happening when you go upper is you look at more fine cosine, just kind of smaller mesoscale and finer scale. And now you go down, and that's scary, all those values, and they are kind of redundant, and it's just not very useful. None of them are significant. So then I selected a subset of them. So here I have 6 in the PowerPoint. Sorry, I had 10. But so here I selected just a few of them. And the way I select them is a large scale and then another mesoscale, and so on and so forth. And I should have them somewhere in the code. Sorry about that. Where is it? Yes, so here, if you could see, I select the first sine cosine, the larger scale. Then I add 19. Then I use 31, 45, 94, and 300. So I just look at those kind of large scale processes. I didn't look at too fine scale, because if the fine scale in our case will be close to 700. So let's go there. They're not significant, 500, 600, they're barely significant or not significant. So when my students are using those methods, I always tell them, please think of what would be the process or the processes that can be explained by those large scale, mesoscale, or fine scale. So in my case of the Hovenberg, as I presented several times, there's a large scale. So of course I need the first one. But then maybe I need only a few of the other scales. So you need to be able to explain what are the pattern at those scales that you are including in your regression. Like here, I include only 6 of them. And then there's the geographical weighted regression. Again, the first step here, oops, not that. Doesn't show in here. Sorry about that. Is to decide the first step that the geographical weighted regression will do is to decide what is the bandwidth. So this is giving here by this, what is the adaptive size of number of neighbor I will use in the analysis of each sampling location. So this is an iterative process to decide how big I should use the neighbor to compute my regression for each sampling location. And then you put that in your regression. So in this case, they converge about 25 neighbors in some ways. And then that's it.
All right, thank you very much. That was great. There are multiple questions here. Can I go ahead and I'll relay them to you? The first one is really interesting. The question here is that you have presented a number of different techniques, analysis techniques for spatial data. When confronting a new spatial data set, do you have any recommendation for what approach to start with and which order that one should go about analyzing this new data set?
Well, of course, rule number 1, plot your data. So plot them in space. And then the same way that with the Hovenberg, we computed spatial autocorrelation. So look at the degree of spatial autocorrelation in the original data set. So then it will help you to decide, is there just like in the case of I presented, it was very simple. There was a big trend, but then it would be a case where you will see, is there more than one trend or more than one process that I need to incorporate?
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a question, it's how to account for spatial autocorrelation when one is building a predictive model using some of these machine learning approaches like boosted regression trees or random forest. Apparently, there's an article, ILIS 2008, that does not explain in their guide. It was published in Journal of Animal Ecology.
Yes. Again, you can explain everything with space. So in those regression trees, boosted regression, random forest, all of those, if you add XY coordinate, it could explain everything. Because especially in the case of what I'm showing before you, I had a large trend. So the model, the first split in those recursive methods of splitting the data, the first split will be space. So then, is it really what you want to know? So if you're more interested in the process or the processes, don't add XY coordinate, or detrend your data somehow and plot your residuals and do the random forest or whatever regression tree with your residual, because space is going to be the first predictor, first split. Mm-hmm. So I myself find that this is not informative. I mean, space, again, is your last resort to indicate that something is missing. So let's say in Canada, it's a large country, we don't have a weather station throughout. So sometimes people will use XY coordinate to compensate for the climatic information. But then it's obvious that as you have a gradient north-south, the temperature will change as well. So it's not informative of the real process or factor that affect your data. So I think if you can, don't use at first XY coordinate or detrend. So in geostatistics, people will do that. They will use universal kriging. So they will remove the big trend surface analysis and do the variogram on the residual. So it's been this regression kriging that I showed you, or the generalized least square model. That's really what is happening. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So it seems like you're touching on the difference between when you're interested in inference, you're trying to understand the processes that influence your outcome rather than just plain prediction per se, right? And so when you're interested in the process, then be careful with adding the spatial coordinates.
Well, as I show you with my spatial predictor, the spatial filtering, my R-square were always better. But I didn't explain really why. I just have a better fit. So yeah, you have a better fit, but not better understanding. And especially with the Morin, again, vector map, this is true for the sampling regime of this location. If I go to another location, the sampling regime is maybe different. The spacing between the samples are maybe different. So of course now I had a regular grid, but if it was irregular grid, then you cannot infer what would be happening in another region, because it's really specific of the spatial layout of the region that you study first. So you have a better fit, but not a better understanding.
Yep. And so the next question is there a difference between temporal and spatial correlation? And can we have both in a study system? Would they be treated at the same time, or how would you go about dealing with both?
Right. So Noel Cressy and Chris Winkle have an excellent book on spatial and temporal data analysis, and they present snapshots, so different spatial realization where they do the analysis and they stack them through time, or they have a time series analysis, but it's very hard to do both of them together. And the reason is the following, is that the first series of spatial regression, not the spatial filtering, still have the assumption that there's only one process, right? There's the stationarity somewhere. So then what is happening with space and time is that the stationarity of the process may break, right? You may have some kind of change of climate, of change of something. So your prediction, your inference space is going to break at one point, either in space and time. So then the same way that that may be the only one liking the geographical weighted regression that I show my region. So you will need to do the same thing in time, is to say, when do I have the same process or intensity of the process occurring? So I think it's where knowledge is important of the changes. So it's a piece regression will tell you maybe change in the time series analysis, or yes, I mean, you need to understand that spatial autocorrelation, spatial analysis is being derived from time series analysis. So they have life easier because time goes in one direction. In spatial autocorrelation, we have both the dimension anisotropy, and the time dimension will make things change, of course.
Yeah. And for, let me see, for the multiple scale analysis, is it possible to do it with, for example, raster files of different resolutions, or the multiple scales refers to something else?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that at all. That would be even more difficult, but yes. So let's say the case I had the same grain, the same sampling size, and the same extent. I just changed the way I decided the relationship, the neighborhood, if you want to decide the large scale and more nearby neighborhood values. By having different grain or different extent, now you change everything. And then by having different grain, you could assess within the quadrat what is the behavior and other processes that are important within my 10 by 10 kilometer. That's huge, right? Of course. But then, yeah, it will be a kind of hierarchical, nested, complex design, but you will need to, I would not suggest that. What people are doing often is they use this as a finer grain, smaller resolution. You maybe find a model, and then you can use that regression and put it at another scale. I'm just worried that you're having so much the modifying area unit problem, so you will confound processes.
Yeah, I think that's a common question due to the availability of these rasters of all sorts of variables, trying to figure out, well, should I take an average across a big scale? Should I take at the point where my observation is? Which scale should I use, right? And seems like, yeah.
So let's say sometime you have two resolution. So what we do in my lab is I say to my student, please coarse the finer resolution to the large coarse resolution that you have. But you lose, of course, the fine scale issues. But then you are on the same footing. Otherwise, you don't have the same footing. Yeah, that's a big issue. If you were to split the larger 10 by 10 and smaller one, you don't gain information. So that's the problem. Yeah.
Right. So the question here is, do you have any suggestions for applying some kind of spatial autocorrelation control for directional data? So anisotropic relationships, non-symmetric distance matrices, such as those produced by ocean or wind currents.
Yeah, right. So the spatial error models that I presented was not accounting for directionality. So that's for sure. And directionality is definitely crucial and important. So then maybe geostatistic would be better in that way, that you can have a model for different direction and fit this kind of regression trigging that I presented. That could be better. I never use it for anisotropic values, so I cannot say if indeed they are doing it, but in essence, geostatistic has anisotropy, zonal or geometric one that you can include. So I guess there's potential there. I've never looked into it, but that's what I would look first. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder with the matrices that define who's neighbor of whom, if there's a way of adapting your definition of neighbor that does not depend just on distance, but kind of in which sense? So you can think about downstream, upstream, and things like that, right?
Well, then you need to look at Geverhoff and Aaron Peterson. We look in dendritic system. We add with geostatistic, you can do tail up, tail down. So you could include the directionality. So that's something that exists. People have done that. That's known. But that's a geostatistic anisotropy in a kind of regression setting. Yes, that we have done that. Yes, definitely. The neighborhood. So that's why I said to look at Stefan Drey 2011 paper in Geographical Analysis. He present the kind of the broader family of Moran eigenvector map, and then you can do it doesn't need to be a PCNA. You can just do a connectivity. You can decide what is your connectivity. From Guillaume Blanchet is looking at asymmetric Moran eigenvector map, so you can have this up down, strip up, and strip down connectivity. People have done that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned how some of the spatial models were originally time series models that were then kind of generalized to the spatial setting. So there's a question related to that. Is there an analog to the moving average term in ARMA models or the integration aspect of ARIMA models? I would imagine that the true spatial dimensions might make an ARIMA style impossible compared to a time series.
Yes, there is moving average. You can look at the kind of cursor, a template, 3x3, if you think of as a regular grid. So you can do moving average, but you won't have this ARIMA aspect, no. But that's what the previous question the person was asking, space and times. That's a little bit what you would like to know, those breaking points, right? So how to assess that in space and time, that's what we need to do because of the lack of stationarity, again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's this person that's asking how to deal with variables that have different representations and scales, like point and polygon, right? Is there a redundancy in the errors combining these variables? How can we manipulate when we include time as a variable?
Oh, time. Well, polygons, you have just one value, right? And it's an area. And point, well, they have just XY coordinates. So often it's like what we do in landscape ecology. We assign the same value for the entire patch, or you can have variance, the variability. But in time, I'm not sure what is the question. I must say it's not completely clear how to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess some of these questions could also be related to the small area estimation kind of approaches where sometimes you can think of a process that's happening at a finer scale, but that you integrate over the polygon to understand that relationship, right?
Right, exactly. Well, that's what the previous question of having different sampling units, right? Mm-hmm. So you're going to lose. So in simulation, people are using meta models, right? So you have a process at one scale that you summarize to be incorporating it at another scale. So that's what I was telling you that we can do it. You have a small resolution, you have a regression, and you use this relationship at the upper scale. But it's needed. You need to understand really what you're doing and what is your question.
Yeah. And we don't have much additional time, so I'm just gonna ask the final question here. in a generalized linear model with Poisson distribution and spatial filter, how would one calculate R squared? Specifically, since R squared is typically calculated as some ratio between the fit of the model versus a null model, I wonder what would be the appropriate null model for that calculation.
For the Poisson, or
yeah, the specific example was a GLM with Poisson distribution and spatial filter.
Spatial filter. Well, without the spatial filter, or with the spatial filter, that's the very yeah, I would need to think of it, but my gut instinct is really to say, well, the absence of spatial structure is your null model, right? So we assume that there's no relationship. So there would be, in the case where, let's say with Poisson, you could have spatial structure, so you maybe want to remove it. So I'm honestly, I would need to think of this one. Yeah. But my gut feeling is the absence of spatial structure. No filtering, no structure.
Yeah. All right, that's fantastic. There were some additional questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of them. But as they show here, there's a lot of interest on this topic. I think it's very important. Almost all the data sets that people collect are spatial in some way or another. So this is a very important topic, and I really appreciate you going over all the different approaches that one could adopt to analyze these data. Right. So thank you very much for agreeing to present. Thank you all for coming to this presentation. I hope it was useful, and see you in our next webinar.